Good afternoon and good day to everybody all over the world. I'm going to talk today about Earth system justice. And my argument will be without a just approach, we may not be able to live within Earth system boundaries. Now, my narrative is essentially that we have Earth system boundaries and other arguments which imply that there is a shrinking ecospace or environmental utilization space. That means the resources that we can use and the pollution that we can emit is limited. When you have such limited ecospace, this requires sharing. Then I take a slightly different storyline because I look at 30 years of climate negotiations and I argue that in fact, 30 years ago, trying to address this problem in a just way would have been much easier. And instead, what has happened is during the negotiations, a number of mistakes have been made, in my view, and these have multiplied injustices, and therefore the North is losing control over the problem. And so I argue that Earth system justice is urgently needed, and without such justice, living within these boundaries, within the environmental space, will not be possible. So let me try and explain to you what I mean by Earth system boundaries and other arguments. So basically, imagine a sort of a cake, and the cake is the space that we are to share amongst each other. Now, this cake is shrinking over time. Why? If you look at metals and minerals and the projections today, as well as what might become available in the future, what we find is that many strategic minerals and metals are actually in low quantities. And this basically means we have to start sharing these abiotic resources amongst people if we want to ensure that everyone has some degree of access. Now we have the sort of the reverse problem when we talk about fossil fuel. We have too much fossil fuel. So essentially, if we want to meet the 1.5 degrees centigrade target, more than 80% of the existing fossil fuels cannot be used. And so therefore, we have to leave that fossil fuel underground. And the question is, who is going to leave it underground? If you talk about land and fresh water, well, land is more or less fixed. So is fresh water, but the way in which land is being degraded, fresh water is being used and polluted, it basically means it's shrinking. And at the same time, we have rising demands from a growing world population, which is becoming also richer by the day. And this basically means that their demand will keep going up. And as a result, the per capita availability of land and fresh water is diminishing. And so we would have to share that. If you look at the story of planetary boundaries, that's based on when we will cross tipping points, then what we find is that there is a sort of boundary level. And in fact, in the area of climate change, biosphere, fresh water, and regional levels, we are crossing this boundary. On aerosol loading, perhaps we have not yet crossed the boundary. But essentially, this means that our demands on this ecospace, which keep going up, have to somehow be reduced. And then, of course, we have a shrinking sink. So we have all kinds of standards about what we can pollute into the air, into the water, etc. So we have these standards, but the rate of pollution is going up. And essentially, this means we have to decide which industries need to shrink, which users and users of various resources that lead to pollution need to change. And this is also a sharing problem. Now, before I go ahead, perhaps you want to spend a bit of time talking about the population challenge. A lot of people focus on population as the major driver of demand. Now, we have enough research to show that, in fact, today, it is the consumption of the top that matters much more than the population at the bottom. But nevertheless, I would like to spend some time about this topic. First, families make choices based on how infant mortality works out in their neighborhood, cultural, religious perspectives, gender equality, relationships, education level, and access to economic security. Moreover, people live much longer today, and populations of countries is a dynamic story, because if you have fewer children today, there will be fewer children in the future. And if you have more children today, there will clearly be more children in the future. And so focusing on population growth as a symptom or as a driver of the problem diverts attention away from the main problem, which is overconsumption by the few and the growing inequalities. Now, as this ecospace shrinks, the demands for justice increase. So if you take climate change, and I will come back to this slide once more, but essentially, if you take time on the x-axis and greenhouse gas emissions on the y, at a certain point, we have to get to zero of greenhouse gas emissions. And so this means that as we move towards getting to zero emissions, the conflict and the disagreement and the distrust will increase, and therefore there will be a greater and greater demand for justice. And you're seeing this worldwide with the youth demanding justice, with indigenous communities demanding justice, and with a worldwide and even developing countries demanding justice at negotiations. The good news, however, is if we actually maintain the planet well, it can really continuously provide us with ecosystem services. So my first point was that for a number of reasons, our ecospace or the environmental utilization space is shrinking. And because it is shrinking, we have to redistribute as well as perhaps develop technologies in order to be able to live within that space. Now, I'm going to go into my second storyline where I'm going to talk a little bit about meeting the basic needs of people worldwide and whether that's possible within the existing ecospace. So if you look at my diagram here, so we have a sort of a space, a corridor or ecospace, then you have a sort of a safe boundary, and the black line shows you the level in 2018. Now, in 2018, we can assume that all things are kept constant. But around 1/3 of the global population at that time lacked access to basic resources. Now, if you were to provide them, this was our hypothesis, if you were to provide them access to water, food, energy, and infrastructure at two different levels, either level 1 or level 2, this would mean we would be very much in the danger zone. And that would basically imply that we would have to redistribute that corridor amongst all of us. And so what we tried to do was to calculate what does it mean when we talk about access to energy, water, food, and infrastructure. Infrastructure was divided into housing and transport, and we tried to work on two levels. And believe me, the levels are quite low. In energy, for example, we're really talking about 3 lamps or 1 lamp and a fridge or just 1 fridge. So it's really a low number. And for water, it's about water for drinking, cooking and sanitation. Food is using some WHO Lancet standards, and infrastructure and housing, it's sort of more or less equivalent to a parking space. And then for transport, we had 12.3 kilometers, 9.5 to 12.3 kilometers per day, because precisely the poor people have to travel quite a long distance to collect water or to go to work. And then when we calculated what it meant that, at least for climate change, if you were to meet minimum needs, you would create an additional pressure to what there already was in 2018 of 15 to 26%. That's huge. In the other areas, when you're talking about blue water, it would go up from 2% to 5%. But that depends a little bit on where you are in the world with respect to blue water, because their regional boundaries make a big difference. So in this graph, I'm trying to show what happens in the case of climate. So the green part of this graph tells you what is the safe pressure on climate change in 2018 for a 50% chance of reaching below 2 degrees centigrade by 2100. The orange zone shows you the current pressure on climate change. So we are quite high compared to for a 50% chance of being below 2 degrees. And then the hypothetical pressure of those people who are below the minimum if they achieve minimum access to only food, water, energy, and infrastructure. We're not talking about health and education and all the rest. So you can already see that we are in that orange zone. So we are already causing a huge amount of damage. And suppose you put the entire world at the lowest possible level, at sufficiency level, you'd still be at that black line in this graph. So you would still have a massive impact on climate change. And that basically means we have to both redistribute as well as develop appropriate technologies. Now, you might think, okay, this is really a lot, but in fact, the pressure from the lowest 30% of the world is more or less equivalent to the pressure caused by the richest 1 to 4%. So we are really talking about a huge amount of inequality. So to sum up, if we are serious about implementing the SDGs and making sure that people have access, and we want to live within the boundaries, then we will have to redistribute and use technological progress to ensure that we fit within that boundary. Of course, there are some limits to that analysis, which we published in Nature Sustainability. We only look at access. We don't talk about whether access is possible without reallocation. We will come to that later. We look at access in terms of biophysical parameters. We only look at 4 material issues. We've oversimplified the information. We're probably underestimating. A universal access level does not deal with justice in a particular context. We don't deal with differences in gender and age. We take income distribution as a proxy indicator for impact, and we focus only on 2018. Okay, so that was the second part of my story, which is that if you want to meet the minimum needs of people according to the social goals of the SDGs, we will further cross the planetary boundaries unless we have a more just distribution of resources. Now I'm going to talk about climate change, but I'm going to do it slightly differently. I'm going to show you the history of climate change and how the injustices have multiplied over time. So for those of you who are not familiar, I try to show you that from 1990, we started the negotiations. We had a climate treaty or climate convention adopted in 1992, a Kyoto Protocol adopted in 1997, a Doha Amendment, and then a Paris Agreement adopted in 2015. Now, in the climate convention, there were targets for developed countries, but they were so vaguely worded that most countries did not implement them. In the Kyoto Protocol, there were targets for developed countries for the period 2012 to 2015. 2008, but the US and Canada do not join, so the whole of North America does not participate in the Kyoto Protocol. And then we had Doha Amendment, which had targets, but unfortunately, it entered on the last day of 2020. So although the targets were meant to apply for the period 2012 to 2020, they didn't send any message out to the rest of the world because the targets only entered into force on the last day of 2020. And then in 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, and the targets are voluntary and they are bottom up, and they move from 2020 onwards. So that's basically the history in a nutshell. Now, let me give you again the same story that I gave you earlier about the time on the x-axis, greenhouse gases on the y-axis. Let's go back to 1990. In 1990, there was a sort of quite a large cake of greenhouse gas emissions that we could share between countries. And this cake would grow till a point And then, of course, it would start to shrink. Now, this means that it would have been easier to share the cake in 1990 than to share the cake as we move into the future. And this implies that we have been we've been pushing the discussion about what is this budget of total greenhouse gas emissions that are permissible to the future. So you see that when we are talking about defining a budget for the global community, a carbon budget, a carbon cake, it took us 25 years to define the budget legally. And this is a deliberate delay, and it is leading to the closing of the window of trying to achieve 1.5 to 2 degrees. And as a consequence, we are exposed to high impacts and increasing costs of stranded assets, which I will explain subsequently. Now, so I took this old graph because I couldn't find a good one for recent years. But basically, if your total carbon budget is 790 gigaton carbon for a 2-degree world, we already used a substantial amount. So essentially, there was a small amount left to be shared between all countries. And this is for 2 degrees centigrade. For 1.5, it's even lesser. So the cake is shrinking very, very fast. At the same time, the question is 1.5 safe and just for people? At the plenary in Davos 2023, we argued that 1 degree centigrade is more just than 1.5 degrees centigrade because even today at 1.2 degrees centigrade, we are seeing too many impacts. And this discussion has been pushed to the future because no one was willing to discuss these targets politically. So therefore, today what has happened is we are in overshoot, we're emitting too much, and we're hoping that we can somehow compensate this overshoot by extracting carbon from the atmosphere in different ways. And this is basically encapsulated in the idea of net zero. So this is the first problem, that the fact that we kept delaying the definition of how big the budget should be. And then the next question is, how do you allocate the budget? So this is now we are actually exacerbating the injustices caused by the delay in postponing the budget. Now, if you come to the second point, in 1992 to 1997, the convention was basically talking about common but differentiated responsibilities. And essentially, it said that the rich countries should take action first, but the language was vague. And therefore, the target did not really come out strongly. After that, between 1997 and 2008, we did not have a target. Between 2008 and 2012, we did adopt targets for the rich countries, but essentially it was quite limited because it was only to reduce their emissions by 5.2%. And that basically enabled a certain degree of grandfathering, especially when seen in combination with the instrument of emissions trading. But as I mentioned to you earlier, the US and Canada did not participate in this 5-year period. Then we had targets for the period 2012 to 2020, but unfortunately, it entered into force only on the last day. So its actual impact in mobilizing change was quite limited. And now from 2020 onwards, it's all bottom up. But the problem is when you have a bottom-up process where everyone does what they want to do, the targets don't add up to what is needed. And also the targets are basically conditional on what other countries do. So as a consequence of this, what we are seeing is that as the budget shrinks and as the impact increases, the stranded assets increase and demands for justice increase. I seem to have frozen, so I'm going to stop share and start again. Sorry. Right. So as the budget shrinks, what you see is that the demands for justice, the rising conflict, disagreement, distrust between countries, between people is growing rapidly. And this is also reflected in the way in which the youth and other movements are now demanding justice in the climate movement. Um, and then the effect of the way we behaved, delaying the budget, delaying proper a rule-based approach to sharing the budget has meant increased carbon lock-in in both the global north and the global south, because both thought, okay, we can, it's not serious enough to have a global target, so we can delay that. And in the process, so much more fossil fuels are being used, and therefore more assets that might become stranded in the future are are happening, and there are, of course, high climate impacts. Now, in the early days of the climate negotiations, we were basically thinking that as the world becomes richer, it will emit more, and after a while, it will automatically start to emit less. So there was an assumption that rich countries, industrialized countries, were on the right side of the environment Kuznets curve, and the poor countries were on the left side. So rich countries thought that they were so well developed that they could easily develop the technology to reduce their own emissions, and that perhaps they could provide technology to the poor countries, and these countries, instead of going up like this and then coming down, could take a shortcut to development. So this was the reason why the climate convention was so quickly developed. But very soon after that, it was very clear that even though rich countries develop technologies, the volume of demand keeps increasing in developed countries. And so you get an inverted N-shaped curve. And this basically means that as a, a developing country gets richer, it may be able to adopt new technologies from the north, which reduces emissions a bit. But if it follows in the footsteps of the north, it's going in the wrong direction. And the north needs to reduce its emissions as quickly as possible now to get to zero, and the developing countries need to get to zero themselves. And that basically means that perhaps a lot of the technologies being developed in the north are inappropriate for the global south. The discourses developed in the north may be also inappropriate for the global south, and we may need to change the way we think about how countries should develop. Now I'm coming to another aspect in this justice story, and that's emissions trading. In emissions trading, so we have a number of market mechanisms that were promoted during the climate negotiations. Now, in emissions trading, you assess the total permissible emissions, you divide between countries, countries can trade, and it's seen as an efficient solution. The problem was we didn't have a long-term target or the size of the cake known, so we could not know how to assess. And then, of course, you can divide that cake per capita, which would not be politically acceptable, because then the global south of about 150 countries would get a larger slice of the cake, and the global north, the rich countries, would have to pay the global south for the right to emit greenhouse gases. The other alternative of grandfathering is that the north keeps the rights to emit based on its existing pollution, and then the south has to buy the rights to pollute from the global north. Now, this was discussed in 1988 and 89 in documents and papers, and it disappeared from the agenda, and then it came back in 1996 December in a proposal from the United States. And then it was adopted in the Kyoto Protocol, and basically the idea was the North must reduce its emissions by 5.2%. That is reflected in this small arrow over here, and the South is allowed to grow. Now, if the South is allowed to grow in the first place, then the point of emissions trading is lost. Moreover, if the North can use market mechanisms to buy emissions reductions from the global South, then in fact, the emissions of the North keep growing and that of the South keep growing, and nothing really happens. And this is what has been a really big problem in terms of the third justice challenge in the climate regime, that its focus on these market mechanisms and today on net zero is very problematic. Because although these market mechanisms are efficient and feasible, they're neither effective nor just. And if you can buy emission reductions in other countries, this means you can keep using fossil fuels in your own country. And today, when we have the war on Ukraine, we can see that none of our European countries is really in a stage to get off their fossil fuel dependency. And that's because they've been using market mechanisms and a few subsidies to encourage renewables, but not really focused on let's phase out fossil fuels. In fact, the Paris Agreement does not even mention the word fossil fuels. And now everyone is talking about net zero, which means I can fly to a country outside the Netherlands as long as afterwards I plant as many trees as necessary to compensate for my air emissions, for example. But it's not possible if everybody in the world wants to do net zero, because there's just not enough space for us to compensate this. So this is becoming a really challenging, problematic issue, which is further locking in the North, inducing climate change lock-in in the South, and reducing emissions where it is cheapest, but postponing hard decisions. Now, in doing so, it has aggravated the stranded resource asset problem, because the fossil fuel sector has grown quite significantly since the 1990s. And now, if you don't want to use that fossil fuel, it's a very, very expensive problem. Moreover, we are aggravating climate change impacts. So let me explain the stranded resource assets problem that we now have on the table. If we had told the world in 1992 that fossil fuels was becoming obsolete, then the value of these assets and resources would have fallen. Instead, today it is worth between 16 trillion and 300 trillion dollars, depending on how and what you count. So who is running government, given that the global GDP is somewhere at $90 trillion? So essentially what we are seeing is that we are very locked into a fossil fuel economy at the global level. And this is a very big problem, because then the costs of phasing out fossil fuel becomes expensive. And especially if you realize that more than 80% of the remaining fossil fuel is in the global South. How can we ever prevent them from using the fossil fuel when they can make money quickly, as global North countries did in the past? And of course, Europe is trying to adopt border tax adjustments so that they will tax fossil fuel produced goods from the global South, but global South is big enough to export to each other. So I don't think that this is going to be effective at a global level. And in the meanwhile, most of the investors in the fossil fuel in the global South are also from the global North, because they have the money, they have the expertise, and so on. And this is creating a new lock-in in the global South. So here you can see from Arthur Rempel's PhD thesis that most of the firms that are actually trying to invest in fossil fuel projects in Africa are from outside Africa, and they make profits from it, and they will lock in Africa into these problems. So that's the fourth justice exacerbation issue. And now the fifth justice exacerbation issue is impacts. As we face greater and greater climate change, the impacts will be more. If you just look at the first circled text, we'll see that at 1.5 degrees centigrade, 14% of the global population is exposed to severe heat waves. At 2 degrees, it's 37%. But just look at the fact that at 1.5 already, 14% is exposed to severe heat waves. So you can imagine how many is exposed to severe heat waves at 1 degree centigrade. So essentially, as we move into the future, the demands not only for adaptation, but for loss and damage will increase. And that is why in Egypt at the last negotiation, there was such a huge demand for loss and damage. And then, of course, in the ultimate analysis, the problem is the development paradigm that we have chosen. Since the mid-19th century, we are classifying countries in terms of GDP. And since 1990, we have been marketing neoliberal approaches to the global south. But GDP is the wrong goal for everyone and incompatible with living within the target. And this is not just, not just some left-wing scientists who are saying this, but even the Secretary General of the United Nations announced this in Stockholm in 2022. And I think basically the American dream is turning out to be a global nightmare. We can't all dream that we will have our own private car, we will all have our own big houses, and we will travel all over it's just not going to happen within the boundaries. So we have to start thinking of a new dream, and a dream that functions within the boundaries. So to sum up, I think in 1990, it would have been much easier for us if we had tried to focus on the budget and made rules regarding where we want to go with the climate storyline. But we delayed that till 2015, and that was a problem. Then we should have come up with some clear-cut principles about how this carbon budget should be shared between countries while the budget was still growing. And instead of doing that, and instead of actually following the principles, we just have gone to voluntary approaches. And that basically means it's become very, very messy. And it also means that the rich countries could pretty much do what they wanted. And now there's hardly any budget left for the poor countries. Then the choice of instruments, we focused on the market instruments, but they were efficient, but not necessarily effective. And because we've delayed the discussion on fossil fuels, the stranded asset problem is becoming very, very large. And it's going to make it very difficult for us to solve this problem. And then, of course, in the meanwhile, we are already most likely on the path beyond 1.5. And so the impacts will keep going up. Lives will get lost, health impacts, food losses, migration. This is going to go in billions. And so this has become a bigger problem. And finally, we now really have to turn to the issue of how are we going to look at what is GDP, what can people aspire to, and what is going to be possible for all of us. So justice issues have multiplied. Therefore, I would argue that Earth system justice is urgently needed. So if you have a limited ecospace, or limited carbon cake, or a limited environmental cake, there are 4 governance discourses. The first 3 are mostly under the rational actor model. The 4th is sort of a social practice model. In the first case, the economists will say, okay, let's price this scarce commodity. Let's allow the markets to trade it. Let's privatize it. And most of this is done through confidential contracts. And if there's a dispute, through confidential arbitration. So this is how a lot of the neoliberal capitalists and market people will address this issue. Then you have countries, and countries often use hegemonic power. So they try to avoid multilateralism. They try to avoid ratifying international agreements. Or they go in and out of international agreements, as we have seen in the case of the United States. And this is when they are arguing that sovereignty is important, my country first. They securitize the resource. They're not willing to share it, especially in the area of water, transboundary water. We see this quite a lot. And then we have also another approach, polycentric approaches, made famous by Eleanor Ostrom's work. And basically, she argued that governance tends to be have many centers, involve many actors, many approaches, and we should allow for self-management and experimentation. Now, I think that all these three approaches tend to divide this ecospace. In the case of the neoliberal capitalist approach, those who are rich can buy up the resources, and if necessary, if they're asked to, they can even pay for the pollution. So then they are like polluter pays, the rich can pay. And so basically, the resources get monopolized. In the hegemonic power situation, we get a situation where countries are not really willing to cooperate. Now, you might think that I am exaggerating, but if you read the SDG document carefully, it talks about full, permanent sovereignty over natural resources. So the countries who negotiated the SDGs in the 2030 agenda did not want to give up their sovereignty over their natural resources. So there is going to be a battle between countries to address these local to global public goods issues. And in the polycentric approach, it's essentially the actors that have power, the approaches that have power, they just get multiplied. And I think self-management and experimentation will not add up today to the kind of um, steps we need to live within planetary boundaries. And this brings me to the social practice model, where we need global constitutionalism, some principles and rules of how we live together, how we behave together. And it should be more on the transformative side, and it should focus on goals, principles, rules, and a mix of policy instruments. So, not just a focus on mostly market based instruments. Now, why should we share? What would happen if we did not share? Now, I think there are some reasons why we should share. The legal reasons are that we recognize that each human being has a right. So human rights would play a major role. The right to development can be seen as both a human rights argument, but it's also the right of countries to develop. So maybe that's an important legal reason. The no harm principle has been in law for the last, I think, thousands of years. So it is a very strong reason for us to take action on sharing responsibilities. But one could also reason in a different way and say, if you don't share, it will backfire. So I'm just trying to first explain. So if the resource is fixed, suppose you have fixed land resources, but your demand for land is going up because the land is degraded or because you need more food, then you have to somehow reallocate this land if you want to produce the food, or you have to change your whole policy about how food should be produced. If you're talking about pollution, then we're talking about who can pollute, who can emit, who can grow, and who has to pay compensation to whom. And then when we're talking about resources that are shrinking, like, for example, rare earths and materials needed for batteries, then the question is, how are we going to allocate the responsibilities with respect to these kinds of shrinking resources between people and countries? I should have deleted this slide, but and then I come back to the argument. If you think you can exclude others, that won't work. So suppose we say everybody has to pay for the use of their toilets. So this is cost recovery under sanitation policy, which is being marketed quite heavily today worldwide. Now, the point is, if people don't have the resources, they can still resort to open defecation, which can then lead to local diseases. So there is a problem for everybody if you encourage open defecation. If you look at the fossil fuels, as I mentioned earlier, if 80% of the remaining fossil fuels is in the jurisdiction of the global south, how is it going to be possible for the global north to convince them not to use their resources? Of course, they're going to use their resources if they can, especially if they think they can become rich in the short term. And again, with biodiversity, we are in the middle of the 6th biodiversity extinction event. So we really want to protect biodiversity, but 10 of the 12 mega diverse biodiversity rich countries in the world are in the global south. How do we convince them to protect this. So, the thing is, we have to try and find just ways to address these issues. Moreover, because of actions of the rich people, whether locally or globally, 7 to 9 million people die every year from air pollution. 1.3 million die from water pollution. 3.2 billion people are affected by land degradation. Millions are displaced. Hurricane Ian in not Texas, in Florida was estimated at costing up $200 billion in damage. The Pakistan floods of last year damaged 33 million people's lands and 1/3 of the country. So no wonder the calls for justice are rising worldwide. Now, the question then arises, why is sharing difficult? And I think to some extent, those who are directly affected by the problem are not necessarily those who cause the problem. So if I'm sitting in my car and I'm emitting air pollutants, then it's the slum dweller who doesn't have a house who gets affected by that air pollution. If it is so, and in terms of climate change, if it's the rich who are basically using all these resources, the 1 to 4%, and if they are rich enough, they can also escape and cushion the impacts. Political leaders are elected short term, 4 years, 5 years. So they basically want to maintain the status quo. CEOs are mostly there for 3 years or so in the global, top global companies, Fortune 500 companies. Shareholders want share profits in the short term. Most people think in the short term. And economic approaches have ignored liability, have low discount rates, have addressed the cost of life very poorly in the analysis, in my view, and did not account for the cost of nations disappearing, etc. And scenarios did not take the discussions about the politics of decision making into account. And the problem is globally, we have very few institutions that think long term. And therefore, this is why we have reached the crisis moment in relation to a number of environmental issues. So let's talk about what is Earth system justice. So if you look at justice, most scholars are focused on the local and contextual. Some focus on the global and universal. And a lot of scholars focus on conservative and incremental justice, while some focus on ideal and transformative justice. And I think that we cannot be either local or global. We have to have some way of straddling the local to global universe. But I also think that we cannot use conservative or incremental justice. That's not going to work. So we have to be on this side of the graph, which means we have to be here, more focused on the ideal justice systems and global to local. And it's a multi-level iterative process of justice that we need, because if we take incremental approaches, we will always fail. I'll give you an example, because I've used over here the argument of compensating the rich polluter. In some countries, like in the Netherlands right now, the farmers are protesting against rules which require them to reduce their emissions of phosphorus and nitrogen pesticides. And what you're seeing is now the state is going to try to compensate the polluter for changing its behavior. That's a problem. If we start saying we are going to compensate the rich for their pollution, it's a problem. Let me give you another example. Under the Energy Charter Treaty, if a foreign company has put up a fossil fuel plant in a particular country, then if the government says, I'm now going to close down this fossil fuel plant, then under the Energy Charter Treaty, the foreign company can sue the government for compensation. And then you're actually rewarding the fossil fuel company for its pollution. So we have to watch out that when we speak with our conservative and incremental framework, that we don't end up maintaining an inappropriate system. So we need a completely different, radically transformed justice model. So to come to the proposal that we have made and which should be shortly published in Nature Sustainability, we argue that we need ideal or transformative justice, that the justice cannot be just based on Western ideas of justice, it must recognize the other, and that the justice must include other types of knowledge. We say that the justice must be intergenerational, so between generations, intragenerational, between countries, communities, and people, interspecies, and earth system stability. So it must also protect nature and ensure that the earth system does not collapse. And then we have procedural justice, which is access to information, decision making, civic space, and courts. And we have substantive justice, which says, okay, you can access basic resources. And then when you have the remaining resources, how do we divide that? How do we allocate risk and harm? And how do we allocate responsibility? So that's the structure of our justice story. And then we apply it by saying there must be just minimum access for all, and we must give it a number. And maybe our numbers are not good enough. Maybe we need to go much higher, but that must be organized structurally worldwide. Plus, we say there should be no significant harm to people. So reduce harm from climate change, biodiversity loss, land degradation, and so on. In terms of just means, we are talking about addressing the drivers of ecological degradation, which includes the pursuit of GDP, but also the drivers of vulnerability, because vulnerability is not innate. And all this might mean that we have to talk much more about liability for harm caused. We have to make sure that there are maximum standards, that people don't use more resources than there is. And we have to revisit the mechanisms for allocation. So just to explain the interspecies and earth system stability, etc. So we have 3 I's, which we apply to earth system boundaries. And basically what we did was we want to protect other species, and we recognize that we have already massively destroyed other species, and we want to make sure that the earth system is stable. But in each domain, we applied a different type of expert judgment to come to this conclusion about how do we protect other species and earth system stability. Then we looked at intergenerational justice between past and present, and between present and future. Now, we argue that between present and future, that is quite similar to the interspecies justice. However, the problem is between past and present, we have not looked at it. So that's one of the reasons why in Davos, we argue that 1 degree is more just than 1.5. And so basically here we are talking about restorative justice. How do we create a system of justice between countries to restore harmony between countries? And then the third is intergenerational. So how do we have just solutions between countries, communities, and people? So that was to explain this particular element of the earth system justice story. I'm going to skip the procedural and I'm going to move to the substantive, access and allocation. So if you have resources, then you need a minimum amount for people worldwide. So you have to take that out of the equation. And then you have to allocate the remaining rights, responsibilities, risks, and burdens amongst the people. So that's the critical challenge that we face. But we also realize that you cannot achieve access without just allocation. So let us assume that you take out a certain amount. Let us assume that there is a limited amount of resources. If that is the case, and if the market allocates it, then the price of the resource will go up. And it will make it unaffordable for the poor or for the state if it subsidizes the poor. And very often, resource extraction exploits countries with poorer laws. Certification schemes exclude the poor. Markets in combination with perverse subsidies in the north and this affects the south. Wastes are dumped on global south, so plastics, electronic waste, they are being dumped continuously on Africa and Asia. And then asset managers, so those who have a lot of money. They also exploit the global south. And now we see evidence that people are stranding their fossil fuel assets on the global south. So what we're seeing is if you leave it to the market, we'll get a lot of very uncomfortable responses happening. Now, aid and philanthropy can finance to some extent assets, but the problem is if the investments and export credit continue to bankroll pollution. So export credit is a form of aid of the developed countries, and they have been till last year bankrolling pollution in the global south. And although they have now promised that they will not do so, it continues with through exceptions. Philanthropy is very, very useful because the money they spend on philanthropy is actually spent on solving problems. But the problem is that the money they invest often is in the polluting industries. And also procedural justice is very complicated because you can invite poor people to a meeting and then you can misuse their presence because they're not vocal or they're not able to come every time. So you can actually misuse it to silence the poor. So that was my story on access and allocation. And so we basically talk about having just ends and just ends and just means. Within just ends, we are proposing for the timing, minimum access and boundaries that are more just. And then in terms of the means of justice, we are focusing on how to address the causes of ecological degradation and vulnerability, as well as address other issues. And in doing that, we go beyond what existing IPCC reports tend to do. So our story is without such justice, living within the eco space will not be possible. Now, just before I end, Garrett Hardin wrote a series of papers and books on various issues, including the tragedy of the commons. And he became very famous for the tragedy of the commons. But then he wrote a paper called Lifeboat Ethics. And this paper basically argues, along with several other papers on the same issue, it argues that a few people are inside the lifeboat and they must not allow people outside the boat to enter the boat. Because if they allow people to enter the boat will sink. So that is why he says, don't recognize human rights, don't let migrants into the United States, so build walls like Trump did, don't provide international aid to other countries. And because he also looks at the fact that the US was initially was owned, if you like, by indigenous communities, or they had their relationship on the indigenous people's lands, he argues that if the US tries to compensate these indigenous communities, it will go bankrupt. The white people will go bankrupt. And if they then want to come back to Europe, Europe will not want them. So basically, he concludes that the US white person or the dominant people should not compensate the Native Americans or the First Nations. And I think this is a big problem because I think there are too many people outside the boat. And if there are too many people outside the boat, they will pull you down. If 3 billion people worldwide today don't have access to basic resources, they will pull the world down simply because it's not going to work quite the way Garrett Hardin thought. So I'm completely opposed to lifeboat ethics. So my narrative for today was Earth system boundaries and other arguments imply a shrinking eco-space, which calls for sharing resources and sinks. Living within this shrinking eco-space and providing everybody with minimum resources further requires sharing. 30 years of climate negotiations have multiplied injustices. There are 6 steps consecutively and cumulatively that have multiplied the injustices to the global south and to poor people, and the north is losing control over the problem. And I think the global south will keep providing bills for problems in the global south. And so you are going to see a major justice um, fall back from the global south. And therefore, I think if we really want to solve these problems, an earth system justice model is urgently needed. And without such justice, living within the ecospace will not be possible. So it's not a utopia, it's a necessity. Thank you.